This is Fergus Hodgson, broadcasting from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, with the PanAmerican Post, and it's my privilege today to be speaking with Zack Caceres. He is with the Startup Cities Institute, the Chief Information Officer, based in Guatemala City at the Universidad Francisco Marroquin. Thanks so much for coming on across the Americas.
Thanks for having me, Fergus.
Right, and I will say I was privileged to attend your event just a week or two back now, Startup Cities Weekend, where you explored this idea. But before we examine your latest event, which you could say was a springboard for your the new rebranding or the Startup Cities Institute, what is this Startup Cities idea, which I will say we're very curious at here at the PanAmerican Post and are going to be exploring more? What is the idea that people should take away from it or understand?
The basic idea of startup cities is using startup jurisdictions or startup communities to pilot political and economic reforms in countries that need them. So put more concretely, one of the big problems in the developing world, in a country like Guatemala, let's say, is that the legal system basically doesn't work for the majority of the population. The legal system is very closed off, and it functions mostly for currently existing businesses, people that are politically well connected. And this is why, for example, you have giant portions of the economy and the population that work in what's called the informal economy. And these are people who, they sell pirated DVDs at a gas station, or they sell fruit at a speed bump on some highway. Or this is as much as 80 or 90% of the employment of many developing nations is in the informal economy. So you have this massive legal breakdown. What startup cities are trying to do is to create new jurisdictions under the umbrella of the nation, of the reforming nation, that pilot an alternative legal system in a small area. And when there's a new legal system, our hope is that people can now start to opt into the new system and out of the old system being the currently existing national economy. What this does is it actually starts to democratize access to things like higher quality law and governance, which is what so many people are so desperately in need of in a developing country.
Right. And what role does the Startup Cities Institute play in this process? I mean, you're an educational group. Do you get involved with lobbying? Do you want to and you are associated with the University of Francisco Marroquin. What is your status?
We're a research nonprofit. We don't engage in lobbying. We don't make investments. We're not real estate developers. Nothing like that. What we do is we are trying to develop this idea and to understand all of its implications, the best counter-arguments against it, and also to connect people who are in a position to actually do something in their host countries with the resources and the inspiration and the network and everything to be effective and responsible reformers. It's a very big project, and one of the things that we're trying to do is to make sure that people don't just start bumbling into it without understanding a little bit about the ideas.
Right, and you held an event, second one previously with the Free Cities Institute, but you held another event, the Startup Cities Weekend, just over a week ago. And there you basically brought together people who are interested in this idea and are seeking to take it from the idea stage to actually implementation, overcoming, you might say, political hurdles and then implementation hurdles. Do you want to tell the listeners or audience how many people came to this event? How many actual viable projects are in the works, and what is the likelihood in terms of a time frame of any of these startup cities coming into existence?
Well, let's see. There's a lot there. The event was it was run very similar to a sort of a startup weekend. Some people might be familiar with that format. We were trying to move away from the traditional academic format where what happens is a bunch of people show up. They sit in chairs and someone talks to them all weekend about why their idea is great. What we wanted to do was get concrete projects together and then refine them through a sort of a continuous collaborative process with all the participants until people at the end would have an actionable prototype at the end of the process, so they could go back to their home country and actually begin working on what they had brought to the event. There were about 35 people that came. They came from all over the world: UK, Brazil, Mexico, Panama, Honduras, United States, all kinds of places. And we limited the number of projects that were at the event to six stations. We thought it would be a good balance, and all six of those stations developed something that was at least significantly more concrete than what they came with. I would say of those projects, there were probably four that were sort of real, actionable startup cities kinds of projects, and the other two were more collaboration around ideas that are in the constellation of ideas around startup cities, about how to, understanding them and how they might support a project. As far as time frame, it's very, very hard for me to say, but I would say that our experience, and certainly my experience, has been that things have moved far faster than anyone has anticipated or been prepared for. This was something you mentioned 2 years ago, an event.
Yes.
That was an event. It was a very successful event, but it was very small, and it was also extremely theoretical and extremely speculative. Very, very, very much, guys in front of PowerPoints and chalkboards talking about, is it possible to create startup jurisdictions to allow for major reforms. And in 2 years, it's moved from that to now you have all these people showing up saying, oh, great, let's talk about how I'm going to do this in my home country. And this is I have this connection here, and this is what the budget would be, and this is what our model would be, and everything. So it's moved very, very quickly. And so I would say, I can't give you an exact date for what the time frame would be, but it's a lot sooner than you might think given the scale of this project.
Right. And I will say that too, that I've watched a lot of the videos from the Roatan conference from a couple of years ago, and things have moved a long way, particularly actually into the, you can see, application phase. And there are two challenges that come up. One is, you could say, overcoming political opponents. And then perhaps the even more difficult challenge is actually making these a success. That, what legal structures will you use? What monetary systems will you accept? What systems of taxation will be acceptable within these jurisdictions? Right. When will the first hurdle be crossed? I know that Honduras is closest to that first hurdle, but do you want to explain there, and whether there are any other windows of opportunity in other countries at this point?
Yes, and Honduras has sort of is the furthest along towards going in this kind of direction, and that's in large part just because they very consciously had this idea in mind. There were some people in the government who were extremely forward-looking, and they realized that within Congress, and that sort of they were also part of the problem holding back the country, and that legislating one thing after another forever, trying to fix this very dire situation, was going to be very hard. So they passed a series of reforms that would allow for something quite like startup cities to form. In Honduras, they're calling them model cities, or ZEDs, which is roughly translated like development in employment zones in
Sure.
Spanish.
Sure.
So they're very, very far along. And that's certainly, it's sort of exciting because we're here in Guatemala to have a neighbor here so far along. But other countries have had legislation in place that could potentially be used for this purpose for a long time. A lot of countries, for instance, already have free zones, and it really depends on the country. It can get very complicated for what it takes to get free zone designation, right? But a lot of countries already have that kind of stuff in place. And in principle, startup cities are very similar to free zones, except they also include a legal element, which is a more autonomous commercial law system. And free zones, of course, have a mixed history, mostly because they're usually focused just on economic policy, like there'll be tax breaks or something like that. The problem is that what that usually means is that it's a tax break for someone who's very politically well connected, as opposed to, say, opening up a whole alternative for everyone, which is sort of the goal of startup cities.
Right. Yeah, one of the observations I had at the event was that there was a lot of, you could say, eagerness for people to move to one of these places, to be a part of it, not just in the you could say, activist or proponent realm, but actually living it. Do you have any thoughts on? Yeah, we've discussed. I guess you can't predict necessarily when these going to come to be, but on the open immigration element, or whether that will play into these startup cities, that people from outside of that particular country will be able to move there.
I think, especially in the early phases, it's very, very, very important that the economic opportunities generated by these areas go to the host nation.
Mm.
The payoffs, I think, need to go to the people who are in the nation that's being forward-looking enough to reform. I also think, generally speaking, for instance, in a country like Honduras or in a country like Bangladesh or Mozambique, that the people there, especially, are mostly at the bottom of the economic ladder, and they need it a lot more than, say, an upper middle class American who wants to become an expat, for example. All that said, these over time, especially, these areas offer tremendous opportunity to everyone. It's all around the world. For the Honduran reform is structured so that jobs, a large percentage of the jobs have to go to Hondurans, and I
Right.
understand why they're doing that. Unemployment's really bad. I have no problem with that at all. And I think over time, if this idea catches on and more countries begin to use it, I think you will see a lot of opportunities for people who are not, say, from Bangladesh or from Mozambique or whatever country might do this, to move there and take part in the same way that a lot of expatriates have moved to, say, Singapore or Hong Kong to take advantage of the institutions there.
Right, and yes, there's an investor side too. Not only moving there, you can invest in these areas, or would be able to. At this point, what are the next steps for StartupCities.org with the Startup Cities Institute in terms of your research and future events?
Well, we're really just, like I said, the things have moved so fast that it's just growing far faster than we were prepared for. So we're expanding on basically every front you could possibly imagine. We're trying to expand into producing more regular kind of scholarly content.
Okay.
That will be a big part of our project. We need to raise a lot more money to accomplish a lot of things, so we're focused now on fundraising too. And we're so genuinely committed to startup thinking and entrepreneurship that we're trying to actually make ourselves very different from the usual kind of think tank or research group.
Mm.
And what we're doing is we're trying to form an umbrella, and beneath that umbrella, we're trying to put independent sort of nonprofit entrepreneurial projects, startups of our own, that address challenges that people who are developing startup cities will face. I'll give you a good example. We are working on developing a public finance platform, a sort of accounting platform for municipal governments that uses Bitcoin for internal accounting. And of course, it could be any kind of digital currency. It doesn't have to be Bitcoin. But the point of this is that if you could deploy this onto a jurisdiction's government, a municipal government, you could basically end corruption. The reason being is that absolutely every cent would be digitally logged and trackable.
Right.
And in a lot of countries in the developing world, corruption costs them, hundreds of billions of dollars. It's just a way of life, basically, in politics. And of course, we're skeptical that a lot of legacy systems, current national governments, are probably not going to do this because they benefit so much from corruption. But if we can get a startup jurisdiction to pilot a radical transparency software, what we can do is we can show not only that it's very possible to have very responsive and responsible and transparent government, but we hope we can actually inspire national reform, national anti-corruption reform.
Right.
So that's one of our projects that we're launching soon. We have several other ones that I can't quite announce just yet.
Sure.
But there are several other ones in the pipe that are along those lines.
No, it's an exciting project, and I'm eager to follow it and have the Pan Am Post be a leading outlet on this topic. So if you want to learn more, it's startupcities.org. We've been speaking with Zack Caceres, and if you want to follow this material, we'll be broadcasting or publishing as much as we can on it at panampost.com. So Zachary, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks very much, Fergus.
Excellent, mate.